There are now last lectures that professors give as if they're preparing for the best content they can distill into a single ultimate lecture. This is our last lecture, so I want to say some final and important remarks about short fiction masterpieces, first by talking about their value and their length, and then about lying and truth and what makes a masterpiece, and how they get written and where they are published, and then some concluding remarks and observations about the democratization of the short story and its future. First, let me begin with a quote from the literary critic F.R. Leavis, who said that literature is the first distinction of a civilized man. He should have said of men and women, but nevertheless, you get the idea. The reason we read literature, the reason we read short fiction, is to be more civilized. It also goes back to Poe and the fact that a short story can be read and absorbed in a single sitting, when we're talking about short stories, of course. Think of all the sittings that you would do to read through all the stories we've read. Total words, 114,000. That's a small novel. So you make the choice. You're the reader. Would you prefer a single novel, a single great novel, or 23 short fiction masterpieces? Or would you prefer 23 short fiction masterpieces, an entree into the worlds of 23 great authors? Or again, that one single novel? We read great fiction, great short fiction, for knowledge, for excitement, for expansion of our sensibilities, and all the gifts that literature offers us in a compact and, for many, a more suitable, perhaps more accessible form than the novel, or the play, or the poem. V.S. Pritchett, another literary critic and writer, said the novel creates a bemusing effect while the short story wakes readers up and answers a craving for primitive art. Quote, the wit, paradox, and beauty of shape, the longing to see a dramatic pattern and significance in our experience, the desire for the electric shock, end of quote. You may agree or disagree with Pritchett, but it is once again that flash that Nadine Gordimer spoke of in short fiction, the quickness of illumination that Joyce saw in Epiphanies, that could and often did carry, as with Maupassant and James, a lesson. All literature, as I've been saying, is intertextual, but we can learn more about the interrelatedness of literature and glean knowledge more swiftly from short fiction. I'm not trying to make a case to sell you on the value of short fiction. It's not a vacuum cleaner or something like that. My hope is that the course and the stories we've taken up have succeeded in doing that. Short stories act on us quickly and do, as we have seen, teach and entertain. Percy Lubbock, a literary critic who wrote a seminal book called The Craft of Fiction, wrote that fiction is both scenic and panoramic in narration. In other words, embodying a single event or being panoramic across a wider expanse of times, like we tend to identify with the novel. Both techniques of narration can be seen in great short fiction masterpieces, and we have been fortunate enough to see both in some of the greatest fiction writers from over a century and a half. Scenic single event, Joyce, Babel, Mansfield. Panoramic, Chekhov, Lawrence, Malamud. And in many instances, we've seen the best and most lasting work by some of the world's greatest and most distinguished writers. I urge you to keep reading short fiction because the talented storytellers who are out there from all over the world need and deserve thoughtful readers. And you stand to benefit more by reading great stories, great short stories, beyond perhaps what you might imagine. I hope you'll agree with the assumption that underlies this course, that there truly are great benefits in reading great short fiction, and that those stories that are worth reading and discussing and interpreting and evaluating are stories that can stay, and often indeed do stay, within you for a lifetime. That, above all, is why we call them masterpieces. Now, admittedly, the word masterpiece is a different signifier to different people, and it's a lofty word. It's a word that sounds highly elevating, maybe even unreachable. You think of Da Vinci or Michelangelo. But we're using the word masterpiece here from many of the vantage points that are used to evaluate and will continue to be used in evaluations of fiction or of art. But in fiction specifically, we're talking about craft, we're talking about language, voice, irony, mood, tone, setting, structure, plot and character, pacing, point of view, details, all of the elements that make up this wonderful miniaturized form of fiction we call the short story, but all central in the way the story is ultimately evaluated. And also central is the way the story affects us as readers, its impact, and the extent to which it can make us see, expand, or become part of who and what we are. Perhaps the masterpieces within the masterpieces, there is, or maybe a hierarchy within a pantheon, and there's certainly a hierarchy within a pantheon of masterpieces. Perhaps the masterpieces within the masterpieces are those that allow us to grow and expand the most in our humanity, as they feature ordinary lives in extraordinary ways with which we can empathize, identify, and feel our own humanity. Think of what are perhaps three of the crown jewels of storytelling we saw, resplendent in the stories we discussed by Chekhov, The Lady with the Dog, or Baldwin, Sonny's Blues, or Raymond Carver's Cathedral, since those three resonate with the kind of humanity I am speaking of. But there are those exquisite moments of humanity in so many of these great short story writers that we've discussed, including Gogol and James, Joyce, Babel, Hemingway, Kafka, Mansfield, Paley, O'Connor, Updike, and Gordimer. And we've seen how these and other writers we have studied can make complex and multidimensional human characters who allow us to see the whole panoply of human emotion. We've seen, too, how great storytellers can shape the raw material of life into great stories, and how this can often embody a search for the nature of the art they are fashioning and give us great stories about the creation of art, or that reflect on aesthetics, or the world of the artist. We've seen this in Poe, James, Kafka, Mansfield, Kingston, and Atwood. Short stories are short. Why are short stories so short? Well, there's an author who was quoted in the Times Literary Supplement who was asked why they're short, and his response was, because the author wants them no longer. That quip makes me think of Samuel Beckett's response when he was asked why his masterpiece drama, Waiting for Godot, was 2 acts. And he said, the 1 would have been too few and 3 too many. Exactly so with short fiction. It's short, but it's not too short. And once it becomes too long, it becomes something other than short fiction. Many from the gallery of great writers we have read and discussed are also great novelists. Yet the stories they chose to write were tied to the form of the short story, and in some cases, they can and have expressed a profound cultural moment. Think of Malamud's The Jewbird, or a profound historical moment like Nadine Gordimer's The Moment Before the Gun Went Off. They're both novelists, Malamud and Gordimer, but they're able to compress something quite different with respect to their vision into short tales. That kind of versatility is something we've seen in many of the authors that we've read. All fiction writers are liars. Mark Twain, in fact, said, in order to really be a writer of fiction, you got to be a liar. But they're liars who make us see truth. And great fiction must make us think or feel in distinct or new ways, but above all, great fiction has to make us see, as Carver's nameless narrator in Cathedral is ultimately able to see, ironically with the help of a blind man. In the masterpiece stories that we see, worlds open up to us. Great fiction should make us see the world of the author even if we know nothing about who he or she is. Trust the tale and not the teller, D.H. Lawrence once said, and he was right. If the tale bears truth and makes us see truth, then it is a tale worth trusting and even exalting. If it comes on the heels of the made-up and concocted, the confabulated, the unreal, that's immaterial. Short fiction masterpieces remain ways for readers to be transported into the worlds that great literary artists build. And those worlds are swifter and more compact than the novel, a far more appropriate form given our contemporary pace of day to day. I don't want to sound like I'm slighting the novel here, a great believer in the value of the novel as a genre. And I have a lot of faith in what the novel can provide, and I would also urge you to read novels, of course, as well. But short stories do give us, in that single sitting, as Poe said, the compressed vision of a world. And they give us a great deal in a swift manner as well. And they provide what literature has always traditionally provided, just in a more compact way. And so we come to that essential question again of whether or not we can design a litmus test to decide which stories are worthy of being put into that proverbial space capsule for the future that I spoke of in the first lecture. It's difficult to know what will excite or thrill our future readers, just as it may be impossible to say what nations our great masterpiece storytellers are likely to be emerging from. But great stories seem to possess a way intrinsically of moving us, affecting us, stirring or engaging us. And that's why horror stories like Poe's, Hawthorne's, and Gogol's And nightmarish fairy tales like Jackson's The Lottery and D.H. Lawrence's The Rocking Horse Winter, or Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, continue to have a hold on readers. Horror is one of those things that engages, and it makes the blood race. Great storytellers make us want to stay in the worlds they create, even when there is clearly horror or even pain involved. Think of the pleasures of entering the worlds created by Marquez or Kafka or Malamud, even though they all transport us into worlds of pain. The paradox is that they also reach us and connect us to a vision of humanity, including our own. So fiction, even when it is morally ambiguous, as Hawthorne's or O'Connor's, Hemingway's, or Mansfield's, or Paley's, fiction can speak to truth, and that often means a vision of what life or the human condition represents, as vexing and disquieting and painful as that can often be. And we've seen this. We've seen it in the sad plight of the love-lost boy in Araby, or the vision of unrelenting violence in Isaac Babel's My First Goose and Hemingway's The Killers. Presented in ways that are convincing of a truth without the author having to step in to influence or convince us, without the author having to take even a role in the story that would be made to influence or convince us. Short stories are often intense, and some authors like Chekhov and Grace Paley and Raymond Carver were never able, for whatever reason, to find their way to the completion of a full novel, though Chekhov wrote plays and Paley and Carver wrote poetry, a good deal of poetry in both cases. Stories get written and revised and revised and revised, and often, as in the case of Raymond Carver and his early editor, Gordon Lish, stories are affected in major ways by editors. Many of the single stories, as we have seen, can stand apart from, but are part of connected collections of short fiction, often with unified themes and the breadth or design or arch of a novel. But stories are sui generis. They're a form that is distinct, and to be masterpieces, they need to live. And though there are rare exceptions of one-time drafts like Shirley Jackson's writing of The Lottery or Cynthia Ozick's writing of a famous story called The Shawl, most story writing is a process that begins with an idea, an image, a kernel or piece of a story, or an experience or an anecdote, legend or a folktale. But then the writer's craft has to come into it. There has to be a structuring, there has to be a voice that's found, there has to be a way of moving from a beginning to an end. They say, in fact, about writing short stories, the most difficult in writing them are the takeoffs and the landings. Remember Margaret Atwood's story about all that goes in between being the fun of the story. Well, we might take that in mind when we think about the actual way that stories are composed. They're often composed through many drafts and many revisions. Certainly novels are as well. Poetry is, drama is. One should not think because a story is shorter that there's less industry involved or there's less work involved, because quite the contrary, many stories involve many, many drafts and much revision. The challenging part then comes in, how to take that raw material, the ore to be mined, and structure and craft it in such a way that it becomes a story, let alone a short fiction masterpiece. Some might say, like the popular poker game Texas Hold'em, that short story writing, given its necessity for intensity of narrative drive, is a young man or a young woman's game. Most of the authors in this course, with the exceptions of Henry James, Nadine Gordimer, and Bernard Malamud, were in their 20s, 30s, or early 40s, and some, as we have seen, were quite ill and died young. I'm not certain that there is a correlation here because there are so many story writers who fall outside of the younger years paradigm and who continue to write stories into their later years. John Barth, born in 1930. Nobel laureate Doris Lessing, born in 1919. They continue to write short fiction into the 21st century. And Jorge Luis Borges, born in 1899, was still writing short fiction right up until his death in 1986. I'm not sure it's a young person's game, but the intensity of youth and perhaps of knowing that one is fatally ill can and do play a role. There are more short stories out there in the globalized and much more literate world of ours than we can take count of. Thousands and thousands still in print from years gone by. How many are masterpieces? Probably hundreds, it's safe to say. Masterpieces of short fiction have, until recently, been overshadowed by the novel, which was generally accorded higher esteem as a craft because of its larger canvas and its expansiveness. You remember, in fact, there was a whole debate about the novel between Henry James and H.G. Wells. Should it be expansive or should it be compact? Should it be selective or should it be saturated? Well, you can apply that same kind of division certainly to how we weigh and how we evaluate short fiction, but those kinds of theories about the novel were much more prevalent. The novel was a genre that simply received a great deal more attention, scholarly as well as critical. I believe, with our fast pace of life and the brevity of messages that come to us over email and on the internet, that this has already undergone much change. It's increasingly difficult, however, for short fiction writers to find publishers. The New Yorker remains the gold standard and publishes some of the world's finest living writers. Yet the New Yorker has reduced its publication of fiction to one story per issue from what used to be 2 or 3, and other magazines have either also cut down on short fiction or simply cut out their being published altogether. It may highlight the nature of the recent and present commercial market that Playboy magazine is the best paying, or at least one of the best paying magazines for short fiction, attracting some of the finest of our short fiction writers because of the high fees it offers, including Malamud, Jackson, Paley, Marquez, and Updike, who have all published short fiction in Playboy. Those who love great stories should certainly read and ought to read the New Yorker stories. Stories are still being published in literary quarterlies and magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's and other higher quality magazines both here in the U.S. and abroad, as well as the market for what are categorized as women's stories, the kind of magazine Shirley Jackson used to publish in, or men's stories that fit men's magazines geared toward that particular market. And there are, of course, mystery magazines, and there are, of course, suspense and horror magazines and so forth. But overall, the market for short fiction in magazines and the world of publishing is similar to what we have seen in the decline in the market for poetry. I'm urging reading more of stories by authors in general, but also, of course, the authors we have read, as well as some of those great storytellers we have not read, such as Barth, Borges, Lessing, and Ozick, as well as some of the other important names that I've dropped throughout my lectures. There's a bevy of great short fiction writers that would have to include John Cheever and Catherine Ann Porter, Alice Munro and William Faulkner, as well as more seminal figures like Flaubert, Melville, Edith Wharton, and Sherwood Anderson, and the more global and ethnic writers who have come along over the past few decades and added enormous richness to the canon. Those hybridized identities I spoke of in my lecture on Maxine Hong Kingston's No Name Woman. So, some concluding remarks about short fiction masterpieces. The novel may, as V.S. Naipaul and others have said, be playing itself out, but it's doubtful that the short story will. As Nadine Gordimer suggested, it appears to be the literary form for our era, even as the traditional markets and magazines for short stories appear to be in serious decline and quite diminished. Mid-century, in the last century, was the high point for the genre as far as magazines. But it appears to be having a kind of morphed resurgence in different forms, both oral and via the internet. With the decline of the power of stories to be central as they once were to small magazines, it used to be, here in the United States, for example, that readers couldn't wait till a magazine came out so that they could read a story, a specific story, by a specific writer. But this market has tremendously diminished, especially for unheralded and unestablished writers. It's very difficult if you're a fledgling writer or you're just starting out to get your work published. Very demanding. I'm not only talking about in a volume of stories or a collection of stories. I'm talking about just getting a story out there if you're not a recognized writer in a magazine or in a journal. Yet stories will continue to be told to a growing degree in different venues and in changing ways. We've seen this, for example, in poetry. Vis-a-vis slam poetry, a whole phenomenon of fast spritzing, recited performance poetry that grew in part out of rap but now involves venues and competitions all over the world. And there are places where you can go and actually hear people read their stories, like the old coffee houses in the bohemian world that once existed in a kind of subterranean way that had people reading poetry and stories. But what you see in some of these venues, surprisingly, are younger people reading stories from creative writing workshops in universities, or reading stories simply that have nothing to do with universities, that they want to share with the public in the way that, say, poets have traditionally orally shared their work. Stories will always be told and heard orally. As Margaret Atwood says, from listening to the stories of others, we learn to tell our own. And she's not only talking about the fact that we learn stories in the way that we would put them into print from listening to other stories, but it's the oral nature of storytelling that she's emphasizing. And we've come a kind of full circle, because you may recall that a lot of the antecedents, a lot of the roots of early short stories in print were indeed oral stories, folk tales, and tales that were passed down from one generation to another through oral storytelling. We've read great masterpieces, and within this genre the emphasis ought to be on pieces, for indeed great stories are pieces of life. And many of those great pieces, as we've seen, have grown harsher in their view of life and the human condition. And that's happened as faith has been eroded. The major wars of the last century have had their immeasurable impacts on civilization. Still, despite the more downbeat and tragic content in many stories, there are stories like Atwood's that can amuse us, stories like Carver's which can lift us, and there are the lessons that we learn about life in even the most tragic of the great stories that help us to enhance our understanding and our humanity. Great stories are ultimately all about being human and experiencing what it is like to be human, which often can mean suffering and despair. There is the story on its surface, and there is all that is beneath that surface, just as Hawthorne's Goodman Brown or Chekhov's Dmitry Gurov realized there is a latent or secret meaning beneath all human action. Or think, if you will, of Hemingway's iceberg effect, or what is often described as patent and latent meanings in short fiction. Great stories have in them, simply put, great levels of meaning to excavate. What has changed, even for those characters who do not change in fiction, is the ordinariness of so many of the characters we meet in short fiction, and the breakdown of the once shackling and confining confines of gender, race, class, and ethnicity. Aristotle's idea of tragedy in the Poetics was of a high-placed man, a king like Oedipus or Lear, falling from high stature. Now, short fiction includes the general acceptance of characters from all walks and stations of life by writers of all backgrounds. Goodman Brown, Akaki, the Loysells, Nick Adams, Laura Sheridan, Virginia in An Interest in Life, Baldwin's brothers, not the Baldwin brothers, by the way, in Sonny's Blues, and Updike's Sammy in A&P, or Carver's pot-smoking narrator in Cathedral. These are all, I need add, memorable and dynamic or round characters as opposed to being static or flat characters. They're characters whose lives stay with us, whose humanity stays with us. It was E.M. Forster, by the way, who first made that distinction, and it's an important one, between flat and round characters in a book called Aspects of the Novel. Flat characters simply being one-dimensional, cardboard, round characters being more nuanced and more multidimensional. Today, many stories are told to us in films or on television. In fact, written short fiction is still a major source for film and television scriptwriters, but film and television are different than the written word. The emphasis, obviously, is visual, usually shot by shot, and they require writers, as well as actors, producers, directors, and a slew of others in collaboration. When you write a script, you're usually writing dialogue, or you're setting the scene visually, outdoors, indoors, wherever. But the story is one person's words upon the page, and the story can open up a world because the words can do that. The language can do that. The language can transport us into that world in ways that go far beyond the visual. Am I making a case for short stories over film or over television? No, not necessarily. I'm saying they're all different media. But you can get much more out of the short story in many different directions than you can get out of just about any other medium. There has been, and will continue to be, a continuum of realism on the one hand in stories, and experimentation with stories that stray from the boundaries of realism. Much of the avant-garde experiments associated with short story writers who veered away from traditional realistic or plot-centric stories can be seen in the metafiction example of Margaret Atwood's Happy Endings, or in a short impressionistic piece that is like a shower of innumerable atoms. That's Virginia Woolf's phrase, and that's a famous story that we also, alas, could not include, which I highly recommend, Virginia Woolf's Kew Gardens, which is told, at least in part, even from the point of view of a snail. There's a well-established 20th century tradition for these kinds of experimental stories, which sometimes, especially when they're devoid of a plot, seem to be not like stories at all, but more like poetry. and they can be seen in experimental work of fiction writers like Vladimir Nabokov and Italo Calvino, or American innovators of form and language like Donald Barthelme, John Barth, Robert Coover, Ursula Le Guin, or the great Argentinian storyteller Jorge Luis Borges, who defended the short story as being essential. And by the way, Borges has been one of its chief contemporary innovators. Chekhov, however, is the father of the modern short story and the most influential figure to come along after Poe, Hawthorne, and Gogol with his wider canvas, his inclusion of the complications of ordinary human life without the necessity of including the shocking, the sensational, the moralizing, or the supernatural like we find in Hawthorne and Gogol. Though those elements remain, and horror particularly remains, in later stories like Shirley Jackson's The Lottery or Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. Chekhov gave us the real thing, but then so, of course, in a different and highly dissimilar way, did the only short story writer who has had the title master conferred on him, Henry James. Americans have been most prominent in the evolution of the short story, and Melville, with longer stories like Bartleby the Scrivener and Benito Cereno, again, stories, unfortunately, that we couldn't do, but that could well fit into the masterpiece category, or the sketches that Melville wrote, even the sketches that he wrote in the Encantadas, which move adroitly along that thin line between fact and fiction. Melville really helped establish what William Boyd has called the benchmark for what the short story can attain. Other stories we have discussed by Lawrence, Marquez, and Malamud veer away from traditional links to realism, or to the creation of a world that is, in Kafka's The Hunger Artist, an alternate world. So one has to ask why writers who began to focus more on realistic renderings began characteristically to bring to the fore in fiction the voices of the unacknowledged or of the silent, not people falling from high places, but really the masses of small people. And part of the answer to that question appears to lie in the combination of democratic principles that have gained hold in the West and the mass circulation of magazines to an international public of burgeoning literacy. But there's also the fact that nearly all of the writers under our scrutiny were so often from or identify with nations that recently underwent or were heading toward revolutionary upheaval, up to and including Maxine Hong Kingston with Mao's China, and Nadine Gordimer with the apartheid regime that was dismantled in South Africa. The effects of the American Revolution can be seen in the ways in which more common and ordinary lives became the focus of American writers, from Hawthorne through Updike and Carver. The major dismantling of traditional structures and hierarchies apply to the impact of the French and Russian revolutions, and the concomitant changing nature of common folk being at the center of stories of writers like Maupassant and The Necklace, or the stories leading up to the 1917 Russian Bolshevik Revolution by Gogol and Chekhov, or Babel's My First Goose, which followed the revolution. Political upheaval and revolutionary political change were also occurring in Joyce's Ireland and Marquez's Colombia. It's also no accident that such a greater democratization of short fiction writing would eventually allow for more writers of Jewish origin, such as Kafka, Babel, Paley, Malamud, and Gordimer, or from the working class like Updike and Carver, as well as more women writers, Mansfield, Jackson, O'Connor, Paley, Kingston, and Atwood, and more writers of color like Marquez, Baldwin, and Kingston. In addition to the writers we've studied, one can add many more names and stories to the list of authors, and stories that deserve masterpiece status. It is, by the way, no accident that we see so many writers in our pantheon who were or have also been social or political, engaged activists from a political left that has characteristically been focused on working for or championing seismic changes involving a desire for greater egalitarianism and breaking down traditional structures or hierarchies. This is especially true following the Second World War, as writers like Jackson, Marquez, Paley, Malamud, Atwood, Kingston, and Gordimer were all influenced by the specter of fascism nearly overrunning the world. The prominence of women fiction writers and writers of ethnic origins has been nothing short of astonishing, given the difficulty they had for so long of breaking through into being recognized as mainstream writers. Bill Moyer's interview with Nobel laureate and African-American writer Toni Morrison is instructive here. When Moyer's a famous television interview asked Miss Morrison if she was going to move more from the margins to write about the center, her response was that Mr. Moyer should be the one moving to her center. To quote Yeats, the center cannot hold, leastwise the old center of a canon free of color and ethnicity and sparse where women short fiction writers have been concerned. Truth be told, the short story has been a truly democratizing genre. The canon has also opened up and continues to open up to a globalized world of storytelling and storytellers emerging along with the globalized economies and the advent and spread of the World Wide Web. The canon is being challenged and will continue to be challenged by change and fluctuations in taste and alternate poles of value, such as the aesthetic and the political. Yet stories move along paths prompted by current events and politics in ways they never had in the past. American literature is instructive here. After the Vietnam War, there was a spate of short fiction writers like Tim O'Brien, Philip Caputo, and Robert Stone, who all wrote stories about the war or its aftermath and the effects on ordinary men, women, and children. But read popular and widely anthologized stories like Tobias Wolff's Hunters in the Snow or T.C. Boyle's Greasy Lake, and you see the unmistakable influence of the Vietnam War in narratives not tied to the war. India-born Bharati Mukherjee writes a story based on a historic incident involving a deadly terrorist act aboard a commercial airliner. The management of grief is global in its sweep and moves from Canada to Ireland and then to India before returning back to Canada. A contemporary Indian-American storyteller, also a Bengali, Jhumpa Lahiri, writes a moving story about man going to the moon and an immigrant's encounter with a 100-year-old American landlady. Based on Lahiri's father's story, it also moves over 3 continents, from India to England to the United States. And in another Lahiri story, the war between India and Pakistan plays an integral role. The point is, stories have expanded to become more global, to be more rooted in history or politics, autobiography or biography. And there are still gold standard literary magazines like The New Yorker that publish writers such as Updike and Gordimer, or short story writers of great stature like the Canadian Alice Munro, whom many regard as our most outstanding contemporary short story writer. But once leading outlets like the Partisan Review, which published Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, no longer exist. American short fiction writing is exemplary, too, of the changing nature of the demographic landscape. With a few notable exceptions, the most prominent and often anthologized short fiction writers now tend to be women, like the prolific writer Joyce Carol Oates, or a working-class writer who focuses her stories on the lower middle class of Kentucky, Bobby Ann Mason, or women of color such as Edwidge Danticat, originally from Haiti, and Jamaica Kincaid, originally from the West Indies, who both have produced exceptional fiction dealing with material drawn from their lives and their countries of origin, or the lives they have lived in the United States as immigrants. Alice Walker, ZZ Packer, and Toni Cade Bambara, who write of their own personal experiences as urban African-American women, or writers Leslie Marmon Silko and Louise Erdrich, who write stories of Indian-American life and identify their stories in realism but combine myth and folk traditions. Helen Viramontes and Sandra Cisneros, who write of Mexican-American identity and poverty as an immigrant in the case of Viramontes and as the daughter of immigrants in Cisneros' case. We also have Amy Tan, Gish Jen, and Jade Snow Wong, that trio of Chinese-American women writers I mentioned in my lecture on Maxine Hong Kingston, and the 2 Indian South Asian variety women writers that I mentioned before, Bharati Mukherjee and Jhumpa Lahiri. Multiculturalism and hybrid identities have become commonplace. Who would have imagined it with Poe and Hawthorne? The realistic and plot-driven story appears to be holding greater sway for the present, but this has always shifted back and forth and may indeed continue to do so. What we have seen transpire historically in the evolution of the short story is a movement from tales and fables and sketches to Chekhovian realism, involving perceptions of the subjectivity of ordinary people that involve us in an increasingly secular and existential world, with ongoing significant changes as the form opens up and techniques such as stream of consciousness and interior monologue become commonplace, and stylistics change, and so do the roles of autobiography and history. One would be hard-pressed to find more influential figures than Chekhov or Hemingway, but much has changed since Hemingway, and especially since Chekhov, in the evolution of short fiction, and much doubtless will continue to change as the canon opens up. For short fiction masterpieces now and in the immediate future, there are hard times, but still for serious readers and lovers of the genre, so much to read and so much to study. John Cheever, one of our finest 20th century short story writers and one of the many writers we might have included in this course, were there world enough and time, said, "So long as we are possessed by experience that is distinguished by its intensity and its episodic nature, we will have the short story in our literature, and without our literature, we will, of course, perish." Worlds of great storytelling are out there for us to engage in and continue the ongoing conversations. Stay alive with short fiction and keep short fiction alive.